what we call plenary number 4. Plenary number 4 is like, I consider it an appetizer because it's followed by lunch. Plenary number 4, staying with our joy for a while, and this is indeed our joy, is it not, this entire day? Yeah, I feel that way too. But Fania, Dr. Fania Davies, is Executive Director and founder of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. The title of this plenary number 4 is Race and Cultural Competence in Restorative Practices. And Dr. Davies is going to lead off as the keynote speaker. And then there will be a respondent panel moderator, Jill Bloomberg, principal at Park Slope Collegiate in New York City, and respondents, Robert Spicer is a culture and climate specialist with Restorative Strategies. He comes to us from Chicago. So as you can see, we've had a rather nice, wide response to what is obviously an important invitation that's touching the hearts of all of us across the nation, as well it should. And finally, we'll have, as one of the respondents, Juan Gomez, Senior Policy and Strategy Advisor for the National Compadres Network in the state of California. If Dr. Davies is here, Dr. Davies, I will cede the lectern to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Can we start with a Zulu greeting? Sanibonani. Sanibonani. This means I see you. I see your gift. I see your goodness. I see your authentic self. I see your ancestors. This is such an important part of the work that we do in restorative justice. You saw that Cedric felt seen, he felt heard. Amari has felt seen and heard. And once they feel that sense of belonging, they thrive. So can you say, well, I'll say Sunny Bonani, and you say Yebo, Sunny Bonani. Yebo. Sunny Bonani. Yebo. I see you. And you say, yes, I see you. I want to thank the host of this wonderful institution, President Jeremy Travis, the Honorable Judith Kay. Where is she? In the wings over there. The Honorable Judge Beecroft. Is it Beecroft? Yes. And Tanya Koch of John Jay for the incredible work in organizing this event. The whole team. Can we give them a hand? And as well as a permanent commission on children. I don't remember. On what? On justice for children. Thank you so much to both of these institutions for sponsoring this amazing event. And also want to wish you happy May Day. Spring is sprung. Happy Law Day. And happy Workers of the World Day. This is My understanding is that in recent history, May Day marked the beginning of the 8-hour day. And I think it's time for us to have a 4-day week. What do you think about that? I want to acknowledge all of you who are here today because I know that you do much in the world to eliminate suffering, to reduce suffering. I also want to honor the spirit of Freddie Gray. I want to honor and acknowledge, I wish to honor and acknowledge the grief and furor of his family members, of his friends, of his community. I wish to honor the grief and furor of so many of our youth and their families and communities like Baltimore, like Ferguson, like Staten Island. And, I heard the news from Lauren, and, it's kind of a mixed bag for me. Yep. Because, first of all, we know that the epidemic of police violence will not end because one person, or 6 persons in this case, or however many, 8, are being prosecuted as individuals. It's an entire system, and we need systemic responses. And this is not the subject of my talk today, but I have written about the use of a TRC, or a Truth and Reconciliation process, based on restorative justice principles, to begin to heal the wounds of structural violence, of historical violence, to begin to interrupt that cycle of racialized trauma that we have seen since slavery, and slavery morphed into peonage, and then into lynching, and into Jim Crow, and today, all of that has morphed into mass incarceration and police violence. It's like we're reenacting perpetually this trauma of racial violence. And we need to figure out how we as a nation begin to interrupt that. And we need healing modalities. We need a healing justice. I want to give a shout out to the youth of Ferguson, because they were in the streets. Hands Up United, Millennials United, Ferguson Frontline, Black Lives Matter. It was because those youth left their jobs, some of them, lived in their cars, and stayed out on the streets of Ferguson protesting for hundreds of days. It went as long, or second only actually, to the Montgomery bus boycott. So it's because of their dedication and their perseverance and their tireless protests that the whole world knows what Ferguson is. And now that the whole world is coming to know what Baltimore is. So I want to give a shout out again to the youth of Ferguson. And, you know, history always calls on the youth when changes need to be made, big changes at critical junctures in history. I know it because I'm from the South, and I was part of the movement of children in the South. Whether you're talking about the Birmingham Children's March, where elementary school children marched and were jailed for civil rights, or Selma and Mississippi, marching youth for voting rights, or the youth in Stonewall who gained LGBT rights, gay rights, or the youth in Tiananmen Square. Bobby Seale and the other founders, Huey Newton, were only like 18 and 19 years old when they formed the Black Panther Party. So there's so many examples in history where youth make the change. We need that new and fresh energy. Us old folks created the mess. You know, we need some new energy, some different consciousness to change it. And while I'm at it, could all of the youth say let's start with under 25, stand. Okay. Thank you. So the way I see it, our job is to really nurture these youth and promote their agency and elevate their voices and give them the support that they need, much like you saw in that video, so that they can answer history's call as they are doing. I want to talk just a little bit about my own personal story before I talk to you about what we're doing in Oakland. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama. During the era of segregation, it was really more like apartheid. I was also born in the era when a great movement rose up to challenge that oppression. I lived on Dynamite Hill. It was called Dynamite Hill because black families moved into a previously all-white neighborhood and pushed the color line. And some in the white community responded with violence, with bombs. We were fortunate. Our home was never struck, but homes around us were. I lost 2 close friends to the Birmingham Sunday School bombing, September 15th, 1963. All of these experiences created in me this fierce determination, this burning desire to be a change agent, to create a world without racial violence, without oppression, without inequality. And so I was put on a quest for social transformation, a warrior for justice. And in the decades after leaving the South, I became involved in almost every movement that you can think of in my time. That started with the student, after the Civil Rights Movement, with the Black student movement, with the Black Panther movement, Black nationalist movement. You could say I was a gun-toting revolutionary for a little while there. And the women's movement and the socialist movement against imperialism, the anti-apartheid movement, the anti-racial violence movement, the economic justice movement. And then I became a civil rights lawyer to fight racism in the courts. So I spent many years being angry, being adversarial, hyper-rational, hyper-masculinist, hyper-aggressive. And after almost 2.5 decades of being present in the world in this way, I began to feel out of balance. I literally became ill. And I intuitively knew that I needed more feminine energies in my life, more creative, more spiritual, more healing energies. Sort of synchronistically, I ended up enrolling in a Ph.D. program. So I shut down my law practice, and this Ph.D. program allowed me to study with traditional healers around the world. And I spent a good amount of time in South Africa with a chief Zulu traditional healer, Wusama Zulu Credo Mutwa. And I finished that program, I got my PhD, and was all set to do this healing work, but couldn't find a job doing it. You know? I wanted to do something else, but I ended up hanging up my shingle again, going back to law practice. I was not a happy camper. But good thing I did, because as a lawyer, I was invited by another lawyer from an organization called the Project on Integrating Spirituality, Law, and Politics, and I think there are some of those people who are members of that organization here today. And I went to this conference, and there I learned about this thing called restorative justice. I learned about it from a man by the name of Ronnie Earl, who was the district attorney in Travis County. Austin is the seat of Travis County. He had been attacked multiple times by right-wingers, by conservatives, but was able to keep on getting reelected because he had been using restorative justice to successfully reduce crime rates in the county. So when I learned about this justice that cares more about broken lives than broken laws, when I learned about this justice that seeks to heal rather than do further damage, when I learned about this justice that seeks to bring about social peace instead of deepening social conflict, I had an epiphany because it integrated the lawyer, the warrior, and the healer in me. I could become all those things, and the past, which had been disparate, came together as one. So I, from that moment, kind of devoured everything I could, all the reading I could about restorative justice. I went to conferences around the world on restorative justice and planned to go to Africa to do this healing work. And nothing came. I tried and tried, didn't get a job. And then a friend who's here today, Sujata, said, "But Fania, Oakland is Darfur. If you can do this healing work in Oakland, the whole world will take notice." And another epiphany, yeah, that's true. So with that, we founded Restorative Justice for Oakland's Youth in 2005. Our mission is to promote a cultural shift from harming responses to youthful wrongdoing to healing responses, from retributive to restorative responses. And from the very beginning, of course, given my background, this has been a project that involves both racial justice and restorative justice. Because even though I began to do a lot of healing work and consider myself as a healer, I'm bringing I'm bringing my past as a racial justice and social justice activist along with me. There's no opposition. It's all integrated as one. And also, Oakland is sort of saturated in social justice history and racial justice history. You know, this was the birth of the free speech movement. It was the birth of the Black Panther movement. And now you can say that it's not so much the birth of restorative justice movement, because that happened in Ontario in 1974 and then later in Indiana, but it's the birth of a very intentional approach to race in implementing restorative justice. So from the very beginning, when we started doing our schoolwork, we were very aware of the need to interrupt the school-to-prison pipeline in our schoolwork. And that is a race-conscious approach. Because you can do, as you saw from Dr. Gregory's presentation, you can decrease suspensions, but not decrease racial disparity. No. So even though restorative justice has the potential to kind of push back the new Jim Crow of mass incarceration or of public education, I would say, even though restorative justice has the potential to do that, if we're not mindful about racial disparities, we're not intentional in the way that we do the work, then it will not fulfill that potential. So let me just tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing there. Well, you saw the film. I think the film says it all in many ways. Dr. King has said that justice is love, correcting that which revolts against love. Dr. Cornel West has said, justice is love expressed in public spheres. And Mahatma Gandhi has said that act alone is just, that does no harm to any party to a conflict. So you saw in that video a lot of love. We loved up Cedric. And that is a culturally appropriate or a culturally specific practice to just, embrace them and love them. When they come to the school after 150 suspensions and 6 or 7 arrests, and with the first suspension at the age of 4, not trusting teachers, as Cedric said, meet them at the threshold of the school door, of the school, and embrace them. The principal embraces, the vice principal embraces. This is what they do at Bunch, right, Eric? Yeah. And Eric embraces them. Then they're brought into the office of the principal. The principal often invites the youth to tear up their records of arrest, to tear up their records of suspension and toss them. And just this simple act does wonders. And sitting in circle, of course, when students are seen, when they are heard, when they feel a sense of belonging, they thrive. And that's how come Cedric, I don't know, a lot of our young men come to Bunch with a 0.0 grade point average, severe credit deficiency, not expected to graduate. And they come there even in the 11th grade, and coming into a place with all this love changes their lives. They end up graduating. There was even 1 or 2 valedictorians. Yeah. And I just want to acknowledge Amari. Someone said as I was walking up the stairs a moment ago, to go backstage, that tell Amari that he's the most valuable player so far in this whole day. Yeah. MVP. This is like in South Africa, where traditionally when youth did something, engaged in misbehavior or transgressed in some way, whether serious or not so serious, the village surrounds that youth. That youth is in the center of the circle. And the village shouts all of the good things that they can remember and say about this child. Only the goodness. Mm-hmm. And it's also similar. I was talking to a Navajo elder, and she was saying they do the same thing. I was talking to an Aleut elder up in Alaska. They have a similar tradition. They just embrace them and surround and envelop them in love. And so a person like Cameron, who was 4 years old with his first suspension. Cameron had a hard time when his mother started taking him to preschool. So his mother gave him Skittles. Skittles. By the way, Skittles just reminds me, I'm doing a little free association here. We all think of Trayvon Martin, right, with Skittles? And did you know that Trayvon Martin was on suspension? That's the only reason why he was in Sanford and not at home with his mama. He was suspended for having some residue, marijuana residue, in a plastic bag for 10 days. His mama couldn't supervise him during that because she was working. So she sent him to his father, and you see what happened. But back to Cameron. So he gets his Skittles. He's not going to cry. He got the Skittles. His mom leaves. But the principal sees him with the Skittles, and the principal grabs them and takes them into his office and puts the Skittles in the bottom drawer of his desk. Cameron, being a resourceful young man even then, watched the principal. He saw him lock the door. I can't get in that way. Oh, but there's an open window over there. It's a high window, but there's a chair. So I'll pull the chair up to the window, climb up and over into the office. And he saw the desk, and he went and retrieved his Skittles from the bottom drawer of the principal's desk. When the principal saw this, he was suspended for the first time for theft. And we know that he was lucky, I suppose you could say, that he wasn't arrested for theft, because we do know 6-year-olds who have been arrested for having a temper tantrum. That has happened. Yep. So that sort of set the tone. It sort of set the trajectory for him. He was suspended 155 times over the course of his high school career until the 11th grade. He was expelled from certain schools. He was arrested 5 or 6 times. And then he finds himself at the doorstep of Bunch High School when he's in the 11th grade. He's got his pants down, he don't want to come in. But he is greeted with a hug, and they show him some love. He goes into the office, and they tear up his records. He sits in circle. He feels, for the first time, like this place is like a family. I can relate to this. There's a good feeling here. The teachers here aren't trying to get me in trouble. That's what Cedric said. Teachers, I never liked teachers before, because they were always stereotyping him. They were always basically wanting to kick him out of the class. So for the first time, he felt a sense of belonging, a sense of family. He felt the village. That is a culturally appropriate approach, creating that kind of village. So Cameron ended up graduating with, was it a 4.0, Eric? Yeah. And now he trains with us. It's so funny because we were doing a training in Fresno with 7 districts, Fresno, California. And he was there. And about an hour in, he says, Ms. Davis, you see those guys in the back over there? That's the principal and the vice principal of Stockton High. And they were the ones who suspended me, and then they expelled me. He was cool, though. And then during the break, the men came forward and shook his hand, and he was very affable, very congenial, not a trace of recrimination or bitterness. He was just smiling because he knew that he was here teaching them, that suspension is not in the best interest of the youth, of the community, or schools. Now, I'm just going to go through, how much time? I got 5 minutes, okay? We're way behind, so we're trying to catch up a little bit. So they're taking some of my time. But that's all right. That's all right. So let me just say that we started, as I said, with one pilot program in 2007, eliminated racial disparity, eliminated violence, and reduced suspension rates by 87%, and eliminated teacher attrition. Those astounding successes got the attention of the school district, and after some youth organizing, by 2010, 3 years later, the school district passed a resolution adopting restorative justice as official policy. And so today, restorative justice is in 30 schools, and we're gearing up to get into 30 more over the next couple of years. And there's been a study that was referenced by Anne Gregory, Dr. Gregory, which shows amazing results. Not only are suspensions much lower, and African-American male instructional time is increased by 75%, but we see greater increases in graduation rates, far greater in restorative justice schools than in non-restorative justice schools. It's dramatically greater. Way higher reading scores in restorative versus non-restorative schools. Lower dropout rates, lower chronic truancy. And I don't think there's a study, Dr. Gray would know for sure, but I don't think there's a study that groundbreaking about the academic outcomes of restorative justice. I think that's the first one, so we're really, really excited about that. And let me sort of take my last few minutes to talk about some specifics about culturally relevant or race-conscious practices. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to briefly talk about the history of the restorative justice movement. When we got started in Oakland, the restorative justice movement was about 35 years old. And me being who I am, as a racial justice activist, was interested in race and restorative justice and how restorative justice could be used to ameliorate racial inequalities and racial injustice. And I Googled race and restorative justice and found maybe 2 articles on the subject. 2 articles. So the first 35 years of the restorative justice movement certainly you could say, lacked a race consciousness at all. That began to change when Oakland got in the mix. We helped to organize the first national restorative justice conference that specifically addressed race. It was called Keeping It Real, Race and Restorative Justice. I invited racial justice activists there, including my sister Angela Davies, and Black Panther Erica Huggins, Tim Wise. So for the first time, racial justice activists came together with restorative justice activists. First time in the history of the restorative justice movement. And so a lot came out of that conference, which was in 2013. More publications. Now if I Google race and restorative justice, I see a lot more. I'm really happy about that. And we are having a conference in Florida, the next National Restorative Justice Conference. How many of you plan to go to that? Oh, just a few. Well, I would recommend it. It's going to be in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It's the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. You can go on the website. But I was just counting the presentations, about 60 panel plenary presentations, and 25 of those explicitly address race. So we've come a long ways. In a very short amount of time, we've come a long, long ways. So just a few things about culturally relevant. We saw the video. As I said earlier, that is consistent with Native practices, with African practices, in child rearing, and in how youth are responded to when they engage in wrongdoing. That's a culturally appropriate and culturally specific restorative justice approach. Dr. Michael Yellowbird, who's professor of sociology at North Dakota State University Indigenous Tribal Studies, has done some brain research on how traditional ceremonies quiet the part of your brain that causes stress, the amygdala, and brings you more into the frontal lobe. The research also shows that it's the parietal junction of the brain, which is responsible for perceiving yourself as separate from others, is quieted through traditional ceremony. So one can empathize more and feel a sense of oneness and unity more. And then he points out, too, that traditional ceremonies have been a major way of resisting colonization historically in Native movements. So we are looking at what African ceremonies we can find and bring into the circle. But we need to be careful about that. I'm reminded of a young man who was doing some youth circles. We have a series of youth circles with the mayor and police chief and deputy police chief that have been going on for the last couple of months in Oakland. And this youth did what's called an ashe circle at the end. Ashe is a word in Yoruba that refers to that divine quality that spark of divinity that exists in all of us. And the ceremony that was being done was to say Ashe after each person said something in a closing round of the circle. There was a young girl in the circle, African American, who was offended, who was offended by this white kid doing a ceremony that was African American. So what I would say is that it's okay for that white youth to do that ceremony. However, it's important to introduce it in a respectful way. Explain what Ashe means. Explain its relevance to the Yoruba tradition. And explain that an elder in this tradition taught me this and authorized me, gave me permission to share it with others. So I think that would be a culturally appropriate way of using ceremonies in circles. And the other thing is white people have indigenous roots as well. And in the program that I was in, the Ph.D. program that I was in, white people researched their own ceremonies, their own herbs, healing herbs, in whether Celtic or Sami. So that is a challenge, I think, for restorative justice practitioners. Find out what your own indigenous ceremonies are and bring them into the circle. We are connecting youth to elders in Oakland. And I'm going to finish because I just got the 0 sign. But when we do this work, it's so important to do it with sensitivity and to avoid the appearance of cultural appropriation. A leading trainer came to Oakland early on in Arjoy's history, and there was a Native American woman in the circle who was offended. You know, this is our practice, and you are a white woman, and you have appropriated this practice. There were a lot of tears. There were a lot of rounds. But when the facilitator, the circle facilitator said, I was taught this by an elder, and then she gave the specific tradition. She gave the name of the elder. And that elder authorized me to come into the world and share this peacemaking process. That calmed everything down. So just to sort of drive the point home about being culturally appropriate. Anything we do that is trauma-oriented is trauma-informed is also culturally appropriate. Anything that we do specifically and consciously to reduce racial disparities is so important. And Lauren does it, and Sujata does it, and Danielle do it in their juvenile diversion programs. You can do diversion and not impact racial disparities at all, because most of the youth that you're selecting for diversion are white, and we've seen that. So those are just some of the ideas. There are lots of other things, but I need to end. So how to end here? My dream is that restorative justice might be used to begin to interrupt those cycles of trauma that I was talking about earlier. My dream is that restorative justice might be used to heal the wounds of structural racism and violence. And we've got some models for that. We've got some precedents for that. And for me, that is a very significant and extremely important use of restorative justice in culturally appropriate and race-relevant ways. That's sort of the ultimate. You know, as a racial justice activist, from the time that I was a child, going back to my history in Birmingham, I really have great hope that, we as healers can begin to finally interrupt these cycles. Because as an activist, that anger, that outrage, that furor only stoked the fires of anger and furor, only increases violence in some ways. So even though I still have the fire of a racial justice and social justice activist, I don't think we can really make the changes we need to make without some healing. I think history is calling upon us to be healers. And I thank you for answering the call to heal our children, to heal our communities, to heal our families, to heal ourselves, and to model this new way of being in the world, this old new way, ways that bring about healing and wholeness, instead of ways that bring about devastation and discord and separation and domination. Thank you.
As Dr. Davis has outlined, the harm done by racism in the United States and around the world and in the cities where we all live is profound. And we want to give the young people that we work with an opportunity to learn to deal with whatever harm is done by them or amongst them in their own communities, but also what do we do about the harm that's imposed on them by racism in society? And if you guys could talk a little bit about how you balanced those two approaches and in terms of building on indigenous practices and what seems to be quite natural often among young people and communities, but also then to address what happens outside of these lovely communities that we create inside the schools where we're working.
Well, I first wanted to say that it's important that we firstly acknowledge that indigenous people of this land, the Lenape, Delaware, Iroquois people, we can't be in a restorative justice conference and not acknowledge people of this land. I just want to put that out there. I would say that it's really important that when we talk about this, we don't talk about necessarily just the youth, families, and communities, that we're talking about the community. That includes the system and the system leaders. Oftentimes, the disparity is right there. It's this kind of charity things, this like survivor complex of we have to like fix it, but we're not, healing it. And I think having this conversation is important, right? And I think that when I look at some of the stuff that's happening in Baltimore, and you see all the cops, and then you see this young African woman with the sage, this little medicine bundle, and how that's helping, stuff, one way or another is going to help. But once again, you can't just talk about restorative justice as far as youth, families, and communities. You also have to address the system, and at the same time, you have to be prepared to have those tough conversations. And as a social justice activist or whatnot, you can't just blame the white people. Sometimes people of color are worse, right? So I started talking about consciousness, people of consciousness, and about solidarity across, the different people that are at the table. And I think that that's a lot on us as activists to not just push the blame on the system. The system has folks and champions in there that they're just caught up in the same way, and they're just trying to figure out language on how to discuss this and work through it.
Yes.
I think that there's a lack of historical awareness in our country. We can celebrate independence on one end, but then we have a system of mass incarceration and slavery on the other end. We can celebrate the end of slavery, but then we have trafficking going on in our world. We have these dichotomies going on here in America. And for those that are across the pond, America has a heart problem, a values problem. America is in need of a revolution. And that revolution is going to be led by the young people. And I want all the young people that are here, those that are under 25, to understand that every great movement was led by young people. But they also need advisors. They need wise people next to them. Not to co-opt it and take over, but to walk alongside and to give them historical understanding of what this really is. Thank you for acknowledging the First Nation individuals that were here on this land first, before my people showed up and before Europeans showed up. And I think that what's happening is that there's this reconnection of values to the indigenous way of how we've been operating before we showed up. And it's going to create a healing, but there's also this whole notion, those that understand sores or wounds, that we got to actually lance and go dig deep. So there's going to be pain in that process before we actually get to the healing. So we see uprisings going on all across the United States. I'm from Chicago. Chicago is not Chirac. I just want to let y'all know that. I know Spike Lee's about to do this big movie. I'm just going to let y'all know Chicago in certain areas has a violence problem, values problem, but then there are other areas of Chicago that's doing great. And that disparity is what's causing the anger. So we can do a circle, we can do restorative practices, but after we finish doing that, what are we doing about resources and economic development and teaching our young people about the history of America, this most violent nation? That now we need to change it from being violent to now being a nation of peace. And we can do it here in this room. You know you guys are the largest district in the United States. You know what change you can do for America if you embrace restorative practices and begin to use it in a powerful way to teach all of us. We're just number 3. Chicago's just number 3, but I'm from New York. So I'm bringing what I learned from you to Chicago, now I'm back. Because I know that it's so important that we can create this connection and we create this healing amongst all of us. And so I'm glad that we're here. I'm glad that Fania started off with her story, because her story is my story. I've been reading about her sister for years, right? Then I found out it was her sister. I said, oh, snap. And it was like, wow, your story is my story. And my story is your story. We all have a collective story that we have to bring together. So once we do the circles and once you learn this practice, now we have to resources. Now we have to go organize and bring truth to power.
So I'm the principal of a 6 to 12 school in this largest district in the city, and we've embraced restorative approaches and collaborative problem solving in our school. You know, like a lot of, I've been the principal of my school for 11 years, and like a lot of new principals 11 years ago, I came in to turn around a school, and I made the same mistake that a lot of rookie principals do, and I just started suspending a lot of kids. And then, frankly, a couple of years later, I just said, we're not going to suspend kids anymore, and we just stopped. So, you know, the graph that we saw at the beginning where suspensions were here, and then they just went like that. You really can't just do that. It doesn't take, you just go and suspend. And the school got more peaceful. And so we've had a number of years now. Students meet in circles every week. Our school is becoming even more racially and ethnically integrated than it's been in the past. We're predominantly Black and Hispanic school, and we're in a neighborhood that's predominantly white, so we're getting more neighborhood residents, which is really interesting. So we've started circles for the grown-ups. We started by calling them adult circles, but that had a connotation we weren't happy with. And so we've been having circles for parents and teachers to very specifically address questions of race and racial inequity and socioeconomic inequity. And it's had tremendous results. But what I want to add, and this is where the question is coming, in this largest school district, my students still come through metal detectors when they come in the front door. And the approach when they come into school, the approach outside of school, where school safety believes it's their job to tell students to leave the neighborhood and go home after school, is completely counter to what we're creating inside the school. And I was hoping that you guys could talk a little bit about the work that you're doing in California and in Chicago, and talk about what you're doing inside the schools or inside the communities where you're working to help young people take what they've learned and use that specifically to address the inequities, because that harm continues. So while we are restoring community inside, the harm continues from the outside.
Well, for me, and for me, it strikes a deep kind of chord, because we in this nation have a lot of amnesia, and we're really stuck within a white-black binary. The fact that I have to say that we have to acknowledge the people of this land first continues to remind me of the fact that, as being a Latino Native man, that our people, in a lot of cases, are still counted as white. We're misunderstood often overlooked. We never talk about black and brown tension What we've been doing in California through the National Competence Network, in partnership and brothership with the Brotherhood of Elders based out of Oakland, California, is started convening and sharing our stories. The elders met first. So what happens in schools, we'll bring professionals to the table, but we're not going to bring the elders, the viejitos, the señores, the OGs out there in the community that have clout. We're not bringing in those who are formerly incarcerated, to the table. We just have them on the menu. I'm someone who's formerly incarcerated. I'm part of Justice Leadership USA, right? Things are happening different. And it's really important that you bring in that natural leadership, because you can do anything you want in the schools, but if you're not engaging the community, you're disconnected. And that's what we have a problem with. Oftentimes, we're so in our silos that we're not talking about interconnectivity. We're not talking about being real. We're talking about band-aid solutions. So I would push, even if you're someone like yourself, who you're championing, you have to go deeper. You have a little bit more access, a little bit more privilege, a little bit more, influence on folks, and just bring them to the table. You'd be surprised how much you can do. And when those young people see that their elders, who they grew up with, are at the table and with them, supporting and walking with them, it's a very powerful experience. I know oftentimes say youth-led, but it's youth-inclusive, because we need our elders. Robert says straight up, we need our elders. As young people, we'll screw it up. We need intergenerational kind of networking like that.
Come on, give them a hand. What I want to share, just real briefly, because I know we're short on time. What's going on in Chicago is this whole notion of building these connections between the school and the community. It's great to have peace rooms in your school, doing restorative justice, but there's still shootings going on around the school. There's still violence going on in the house and outside. Then there's a problem, right, with sending our children into a very dangerous situation where they'll come out of the school feeling real good, but then all of a sudden now they got to hit the ground because here comes somebody shooting. And we see that going on in pockets. I just want to go back and tell you that the whole city of Chicago is not in an uproar. That's what the press put out, just pockets, that we're having all of this violence going on, mostly in the Black and the Latino community. That's what's going on. And so what we've begun to do is I'm working with the Cook County government down in Chicago, which encompasses Chicago, Cook County. We're focusing on creating restorative justice hubs. If you want more information about that, you can go to www.rjhub.org. You can learn more about what we're doing. And so basically what we're doing is we're reaching out to individuals who are doing really great work, really great programming, and we're adding and connecting them to the whole process of restorative practices as a way to continue what the kids are learning in the school. So now these hubs, which are usually churches, community-based organizations that are already in the community that kids go to, now they have the opportunity to actually integrate what they've learned from school and code switch it and bring it into the community. So we're training young people to actually hold these spaces, and we're working with the adults to actually create this pipeline of positivity to move the young people from when they go to school to after school and aftercare, where they're learning and continue to learn the process of restorative justice. And we're focusing on a lot of the young men and young ladies that are at the high end, those that Judge Beckcroft talked about, that we really need that extra support, because those are the kids that are going to end up on the streets after they come home and get right back connected. So we are very intentional about building connections to the juvenile court. Priest by the name of Father David Kelly, who is that's the mother hub, that's the actual hub. When you go to the website, you see that. Actually does drumming circles in the juvenile court, and then when those young people are released, they come, obviously, to the hub. And there are re-entered, just like the ceremonies that were done with our joy, and then they're given opportunities to learn these processes. So they now are seen as peace ambassadors and not just seen as ex-offenders, right, or felons, but they're seen as John, Will, Billy. They're giving their names back, right? They lost their name when they went in that system, but we give them their names back. And so we do a naming ceremony to make sure that we know we see you, and you see us, and we need you. So we create this whole notion of connecting the dots when it comes to indigenous and African and Native American, because we want everybody to be seen. That's what Fania said. We don't want you to be invisible. That's why these kids are acting the way they act, because they don't think you see them. They think you don't even value them and who they are as young people. And so when we are intentional as adults, and of course it's going to take resources, so that's why we we asked Cook County Board to release funds. So they recently released over $500,000 to continue this project. And so I'm coordinating it with friends from the And so the hope is that this spreads, as Fania said, that this spreads all over the nation so that we're intentional about the school to community relationship. We've got to destroy the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline by any means necessary.
So one final question. I think it would be really nice to hear one specific example, one short story. I know that most of the people in the room, sometimes we feel like we're preaching to the choir, but there are a lot of people who, when I raise questions of circles, of restorative approaches, of removing police presence or metal detectors from schools, I'm told, you don't understand. And you get comments like, these kids come from these neighborhoods, and that may sound nice and it may sound pretty, but it's unrealistic. And there are all sorts of ideas about, specifically really, that Black and Latino youth only understand zero tolerance. And so we know that that's not the case, but it's always helpful to hear from people who are doing the work some stories that make that point.
That's a good question. The way I'm going to answer that is I'm going to just give you an experience that I had recently. We had 4 men shot and killed in Salinas, California. You probably never heard of it, right? And everybody wanted to, fire the chief. That's the first thing. Protesting. The body was out there for about 4 hours, while little kids, young as 5 or 6 year old, protesting. Pissed off. The family, everyone's pissed off, and no justice, no peace, and then kind of defamatory to the police. And what we did was we occupied a city building, and we brought in everybody that we could as much, and quickly, we kind of got them into a circle. The chief of police later on came and talked to us and said how thankful he was for just us doing that. Because oftentimes we don't see the importance of sitting in circle with not just the community, but with the police themselves. So we've actually sat in circle with the chief and his 2 top kind of commanders for over 2 hours with an altar, with a medicine. Next thing you know, we're talking about possibly, when the new cadets come in, that before they get, out to the community, that they're going to give them to us for a whole day. We're going to put them in a circle. We're going to teach them. We're going to go and kind of make the introduction to the community, different community members, different markets, saying these are going to be your cops. Do you have any advice for them? So I think that when you think about your question, when you think about it like that, is that oftentimes the hardest thing I've ever done was you try to sit in a circle for 2 hours, 6 hours. We do all-night circles. We're part of a Native American church. All night. That's the hardest thing, and I've seen so many professionals from the hard-nosed cry, break down, because even though they made it Ph.D., oftentimes they had to do that, and they forgot their culture. And that's what's killing them inside, and crying, and they ain't gonna let you know. They're gonna come up here and do presentations and all that pretty stuff, and be all decorated, having some initials that they get lost in that. And now you ask people, where are you from? They don't even know. And that's the sad thing about it. That's what we're bringing culture, So I don't want to say that much as I said.
In our city, I was given the opportunity to work in a school where they felt the same way, that the kids were only deserving of zero tolerance. The school was named Christian Finger High School, and it was a turnaround, like what Jill was talking about, a turnaround opportunity that we were given. And I came in as the chief dean, so I came in ready to do circles because that was what my background was, but the principal was not ready at that time. And it was a lot of violence. A young man was killed by the name of Darian Albert outside of the school, but we were blamed for it. They were trying to blame me and blame all of the processes and people in the building. Make a long story short, the principal and myself realized that you can't go in this direction anymore using zero tolerance. And like Jill said, she has the power in that building. He has the power in that building to say no more. And that's what she said, no more. But she didn't know how to turn it around. And so we began this whole process of building in restorative practices. She took away my title, y'all. She took away my towel. First thing she did, Fania, she said, "You're not the chief dean no more." I said, "What am I?" She said, "You're the culture and climate coordinator." I said, "Lord." So I went right to Google. Let me see if there are any other culture and climate people in the United States, Danny, right? Let me see if there are any in Colorado, Rwanda, and in D.C. And everybody's doing culture and climate. We're doing air conditioning, plumbing, right? So I was like, okay. Looks like it's going to be me, like you saw my race, right? There was nobody talking about it, but in that case, nobody talking about culture and climate and social emotional learning at that particular point, because everybody was talking about using zero tolerance. They were all big papers about the power of zero tolerance, right? But now it became this whole thing of reinventing our school, reinventing the course that we were going, and reinventing the way that we see our children. The children, like what Eric said, the children are fine. It's the adults, it's our approach to these young people, right? It's the way we talk to them, it's the way we look at them, it's the way we act around them. And so we began to create these opportunities for these huge peace rallies where we had young people come in our auditorium just like this, in our auditorium at school, and it was like a political rally. So they would come and they would vote whether it was going to be violence or whether it was going to be peace, and they had banners, and we had speakers come, and we really talked about peace, and we called all of our elders, all of our brothers and sisters out of the community, and we had circles with all those kids. Sometimes 500 children would be sitting in our classrooms throughout the building from 3 to 5 o'clock just talking about what's going on. And for the first time in a lot of those young children's lives, they were made to feel valued by people that they didn't know, but they were adults, and they were like, one day I'm going to be you. What is it like to go through this, to fall in love, to fall out of love, to deal with struggle, to deal with loss, to deal with gain? Like what? And they were able to have these rich conversations. So it began to reduce suspensions, it increased attendance, test scores started going up, everybody started smiling, there was more laughter, there was more fun, and these teenagers began to see possibility now. When before, they only saw death and destruction. Literally, they don't think they're going to live to be 21 years old. How dare we live in a society in America where our children don't think they're going to be us? We're going the wrong way. And when Jill and all of us up here, we're all about, you out there, we're all about turning this around. We can do it, y'all. We can do it. I have no doubt in my mind New York can do it. If Chicago can do it, I know New York can do it. Frank Sinatra wrote a song about that, right? You can do it in New York, you can do it anywhere. And so I believe you can do it. So thank you guys for being a part.